we'll get this ball rolling. Thanks for starting the recording. And just as a heads up, we are going to record. If you do not want to be recorded, obviously you can keep your video off. But we are recording so that people who let us know that they were unable to attend can see it later. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this glorious Monday afternoon. I'm Johanna Miller. I lead the Energy and Climate Program at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. VNRC helps to coordinate with other partners, including a partner of the Energy Action Network, Jared Duval, the Network of Town Energy Committees in Vermont. This is our now monthly sort of lunch and learn webinar series that you would be otherwise hearing about from the aforementioned colleague of mine, EAN Hitchcock, who helps to put these sessions together, along with my other colleague, Becca Custer, here on the line. And this monthly webinar, as you have heard about and we're about to dive into, is a sneak preview from our friend and colleague Jared Duval, the Energy Action Network, of their 2020 Annual Progress Report. As you are well aware, the Energy Action Network puts together this invaluable resource for the state of Vermont to give us a much better sense of where we are making progress in terms of meeting our clean energy and climate commitments, where we are falling short, the scale of how far short we are falling, and sort of the different strategies or pathways that we might embrace as a state to get us on track to reducing our planet warming pollution and keeping more of the dollars that we spend on imported fossil fuels here in our economy recirculating in Vermont's local economy and adding real economic value, while also doing our part on climate. So welcome to the Lunch and Learn. Thank you to Jared for the work that you and your team at EAN have done, and for joining us today for a sneak preview. I know that this annual progress report is not yet finalized, so appreciate your time and your willingness to share with us and this important audience what is happening. Before I say a few more things, I want to turn it over to my colleague Becca for just a little bit of an overview of the logistics for how we can make sure we do our best to get your questions answered. Becca, take it away.
Yeah, so after Jared's presentation, we'll open it up for Q&A, and you can type your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. And at the end of his presentation, we will call on folks who've asked questions in the chat and ask you to ask your questions live, so you can unmute and turn on your video. But we do ask you to be brief because we have a lot to cover in this hour. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Becca. And before I turn it over to our special guest, Jared, just one other thing I wanted to note that you all are abundantly aware of is, EAN's work to date has been in service of understanding how much progress we are making and where we are falling short, as I noted, in terms of meeting our comprehensive energy plan goals, in terms of meeting our greenhouse gas emission goals. Now we are all well aware that we have obligations under the Global Warming Solutions Act to make progress in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, in creating more, resilient communities and really adapting to climate change. So that work is happening in the Vermont Climate Council. This, I think, analysis will be really important to inform the climate action plan that the Climate Council is required with coming up with, and helping us assess how do we make progress in very strategic, equitable ways that ensure that we are, again, doing our part on climate, but realizing the multitude of benefits that we can avail of ourselves of if we do this thoughtfully, strategically, and equitably. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jared. Underscore that please just add your questions into the chat as you're thinking of them. You're probably, your questions may arise as Jared is walking through his presentation. We want to be sure that we capture those. We'll track the chat, and we'll do our best to cover everything in this brief time that we are with you today. So thanks again for joining us. Jared, if you want to take it away, share your screen and give us the sneak peek of what your latest analysis shows. Thanks.
Thanks, Joey. It's great to be with you today. Thanks, of course, to the amazing VECAN team, Joey and Ian and Becca, for organizing this. And it's really nice to see a lot of familiar names and friendly faces on the Zoom screen as well. So thanks for everybody who's joining. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops. Actually, let me stop that share and try again. Can you see my slides now? Thanks, Becca, for that thumbs up. Okay, so before I dive in, I want to just mention a few other thank yous and set some context. So, you know, every year EAN produces this annual progress report for Vermont. And part of the reason that we do this is to help make sure that the conversations we have in Vermont about our climate and energy future, about policy discussions, about programs and initiatives that can or should be priorities, that those are all grounded in evidence and the latest and best available data and analysis that we can track down working with federal, state, and local partners. So, you know, this is a major undertaking over, I think we started working on this annual progress report last October. It is set to come out next week. So you all, as Joey and Ian said, are getting the sneak preview. But it is only possible thanks to some really good and generous work, first and foremost from a lot of our state partners who provide data. I saw that Colin Smythe is on the call, who's the lead author of Vermont's Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory that the Department of Environmental Conservation in the Agency of Natural Resources released last week. We also work really closely with the Public Service Department and the Agency of Transportation. So you'll see a lot of those data sources cited throughout. And even though I'm the one presenting today, producing this report is a major team effort by the whole EAN staff team. I saw that our network manager, Kara Robacek, is on. I don't know if May Butler, our dashboard and data manager, is on as well. And our senior fellow, Lee Seddon, also it has contributed mightily to pulling this together. So, you know, before everyone got on, I warned Ian and Joey and Becca that, you know, since we're still actually doing the last copy edits right now, so we haven't written the press release, we haven't even, you know, done all of the kind of release strategy yet. So I warned that this is not polished, but Ian assured me that it's a VECAN principle that you appreciate pluck over polish. So with that, we'll dive right in. I will just note that everything that you see in here in terms of the images, the data, that will all be available likely sometime mid next week on the EAN website at eanvt.org. You'll be able to download the full 40-page annual progress report and then any individual graphics that you see that you like. So I know a lot of VECAN members or town energy committees will use some of those graphics for newsletters or, you know, different you know, efforts that they're working on. And so this is really meant to be an open source effort. Any way that it can be useful to Energy Action Network members, VECAN members, anybody in Vermont who's trying to help share information, we really want this to serve you in that way. So that is that. I'm going to go ahead and start my slides. So I just wanted to do a little bit of context. Many of you know this, but the mission of the Energy Action Network is pretty short and simple, even if it's complex to achieve, but it's to meet Vermont's climate and energy commitments in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. It is a wide and diverse network across Vermont. the added specificity of what are Vermont's climate and energy commitments. The kind of two reference points we use are the emissions reduction requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Comprehensive Energy Plan from 2016, which is currently in the process of being updated. This is just an illustration of the diversity of network members that we have, from nonprofits to hospitals to utilities to fuel dealers to community action agencies, and on and on. This is just a small sampling. You see VECAN right there in the center. This is always how it is. I did not just do that for this presentation. And many of our public partners who we work with, especially on the data side and tracking side. And this is actually the first new graphic from our report, which is our way of trying to describe the difference between EAN, the network, and EAN, the nonprofit. So EAN, the network, is all of those members that you just saw. And then in support of that network, we have a small 3-person nonprofit organization that works to do these 4 things. And this annual progress report is really part of this collecting data and measuring results through regular tracking and analysis. And you'll see that this is not just any mountain. That is Camel's Hump representing reaching our climate and energy goals. So I'm going to dive right into the updated emissions numbers. So this comes from the one on the pie chart on the left, or the donut chart on the left. Bagels, maybe, if we're trying to be healthier, is from the just released ANR emissions inventory for Vermont. And then these numbers on the right are from the just released EPA emissions inventory that actually goes through 2019. I want to pause here to note a couple of things. First, in Vermont, the share of emissions that come from our transportation and thermal sectors combined continues to grow. So now together, they are responsible for 74%, almost 3/4 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont, while the emissions from the electricity sector, or I should say our electricity portfolio, as measured post-REC accounting in compliance with Vermont's renewable energy standard, continues to decline. Only about 2% of statewide emissions as of 2018. And I'm going to note that those that are electricity sector emissions, as reported by the Public Service Department and ANR, are now nearly 83% below 1990 levels because of the changes in electricity purchases that Vermont is making. And that the overall reductions that Vermont has achieved from 2015 to 2018, almost the vast majority of those, 91% of the decline in emissions in Vermont from 15 to 18 was from the electricity sector and from changes in our electricity purchases. So that's the big story, I think, about the latest emissions inventory. We can get more into that. There's also really interesting news out of the US emissions inventory. It's been the case for a long time that the largest source of emissions in Vermont is from the transportation and thermal sectors. But for the United States as a whole, it used to be that the electricity sector was the largest emitting sector in the country. That it was surpassed a few years ago by the transportation sector, and the just released emissions numbers for 2019, the thermal emissions from residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use actually, just as of this latest report, also surpassed electricity sector emissions. So you can see that, where Vermont has been for a long time is where the US is increasingly moving to, where electricity emissions are declining thanks to really important work to retire coal plants and fossil fuel generation and add in renewable and low carbon generation. But these have been more stubborn and difficult to reduce because of the slower uptake of non-fossil heating and non-fossil transportation options. So this is what the new graph looks like, looking both at our historical emissions from 1990 through 2018. And then this shows the trajectory that we will need to get on to meet the GWSA requirements. So a couple of interesting things to note. The 2025 requirement of a 26% reduction below 2005 levels, as of this latest data that goes through 2018, that's a 13% reduction since 2005. So we're halfway to Paris based on those, or the halfway to the 2025 requirement, which was based on the Paris Agreement. So a 13% reduction from 05 to 2018. And these 2018 numbers are interesting. You draw this straight horizontal line back across, and we are now equal to our 1990 emissions numbers. So, you know, we're on a good trajectory to meet this 2025 requirement if we add more policy action and regulatory frameworks, especially focused on the lagging sectors of transportation and thermal. But in order to meet this 2030 requirement, it's really, you know, the total scale of emissions reduction from where we are to where we need to get is really, it's about we have to do 3 times as much between, you know, to get to 2030 as we do to get to 2050, to 2025. So you can see that the incline of how fast and steeply the emissions declines have to happen increases substantially to meet the 2030 targets as compared to 2025. So this is the updated bar graph based on the 2018 emissions from the ANR inventory. Again, transportation and thermal sector emissions, larger share than even before, while electricity sector emissions have declined. Some increases, the share from agriculture has increased as well. So one of the things that we wanted to do as soon as we got these new numbers was plug them into a model that has been developed by EAN, led by our data manager, May Butler, and in coordination with our senior fellow, Lee Seddon. It's called our EAN Emissions Reduction Pathways Analysis. And what we're looking to do is, given proven and available technologies and measured characteristics of different actions, what will add up to achieving our emissions reduction requirements? What pathways and measures will it take? And what we found when we did that is that it is possible to achieve these requirements, but we are going to need a major focus on moving beyond fossil fuel transportation and heating in particular. One of the reasons I say that is, A, that's where the bulk of emissions are coming from, but also because there is language in the Global Warming Solutions Act statute that suggests or encourages, it doesn't read to me as exactly a requirement, but that basically is saying that the emissions reductions that happen in Vermont should be proportional by sector, or that each sector should meet its proportional share of emissions reduction. So if 40% of our emissions are currently coming from transportation, then 40% of the reductions we achieve should come from the transportation sector. So that is another reason. And then, you know, this annual progress report focuses heavily on the kind of economic and equity implications, especially comparing things by income in Vermont. And so in doing this analysis, we found that this is a major opportunity to strengthen the Vermont economy, create good paying jobs, save Vermonters money, and improve equity. So this is kind of the summary graphic of our pathways analysis of, again, given those known and available technologies and what we can expect from them, what would add up to meeting, this is the emissions reductions by 2030. We could spend the rest of this half hour just on this slide and all the assumptions behind it. You know, of course, technologies and markets and best practices and behaviors are always changing, so these numbers will be subject to change over time. But given what we know now, these look to be some of the highest impact and most promising pathways that Vermont can employ to meet our emissions reductions requirements, given where we stand as of 2018. Another way to look at this, and I'll just say these boxes are all scaled by the amount of emissions reduction. So 500,000 metric tons, we are modeling a reduction from electric vehicles replacing internal combustion or gas or diesel vehicles over the next decade. But if you want to see kind of the scale of what that change is relative to the baseline of where we stand now, we also created these bar charts, which show, the 2018 baseline number where we stand on a number of these key measures versus what we're modeling they would likely need to be at in 2025 and 2030 to add up to the emissions reductions that we are now legally required to achieve. And I should note or underline that it would be all of these measures together, plus some others. These are just the 5 highest impact, but we're modeling others as well. We would need all of these or their equivalent to meet the requirements. So if we fell short of, say, 120,000 registered EVs in Vermont, replacing fossil vehicles in Vermont by 2030, we would need to make up that difference somewhere else. So what we're looking at is primarily highest impact, single measure EVs, also efficiency improvements across the remaining fossil fleet, reducing per capita vehicle miles traveled, many ways of doing that, ride sharing for commutes, and then we're projecting that some of the rise in telecommuting as a result of the pandemic will be durable, and that we'll have some more folks working from home, throughout the next decade. So that's the transportation side. This is the thermal side. Again, electrification, and this is, I want to reiterate that this is, or underline, I should say, that we do not see these as either or propositions, especially in Vermont in our climate for purposes of resiliency and reliability. It's often important to have multiple heating systems working in complement, in combination. And so we're modeling both heat pumps, advanced wood heat, RNG for that portion of the state in the northwestern area of Vermont that is in gas territory. We're modeling some renewable natural gas based on VGS's commitment to have 20% RNG in their system by 2030, and that's what that adds up to. But also looking at heat pump water heaters and weatherization. The really important thing to note about weatherization is that even though on a direct emissions reduction basis, it's the 5th highest impact thermal measure. These are ordered in, you can read the emissions reduction kind of totals here in the bars. But even though this is 5th, the emissions reductions impact from weatherization go beyond what the direct reduction is, because oftentimes you can only switch to heat pumps or pellet stoves after a weatherization project has decreased a heating load. So weatherization also opens up further emissions reduction via getting off of fossil fuels from these measures. So I do like to underline that, so that, because weatherization really in a lot of ways needs to come first in terms of how much it then unlocks in terms of these measures here. So I want to talk a little bit about the economic implications of this modeling. So this is for the transportation sector. The vast majority of dollars that we spend on transportation fuels on 100% imported gasoline and diesel leave the state. But when we're charging with an EV, 62 cents of every dollar stays and recirculates in state with our local utilities. That's money that's going to line workers and tree trimmers and clean power producers. So we get much more of a kind of reinvestment in Vermont by keeping those energy dollars local when we're purchasing electricity versus fossil fuels for transportation. You know, there are differences in terms of fuel costs by where people live. You know, rural Vermonters are spending more on fuel than urban Vermonters across the board. But one of the biggest differences is actually upper income Vermonters are consuming a lot more fuel than lower income Vermonters are, and they're driving more miles per year. So we looked at the northeastern United States. You know, folks who earn over, this isn't on this graph, but I'll just mention this data point, folks who earn over $100,000 a year are on average driving their vehicles 15,000 miles a year, whereas folks who are in this income group are driving about only 10,000 miles a year. You know, and that actually is right here, 15,000 versus 10,000. However, even though upper income folks consume a lot more fuel, the share of folks' budgets that, especially lower income Vermonters, that go to transportation fuel spending is much higher. And this reflects broader national and international trends around income and wealth inequality. But, you know, up to around 10% of Vermonters who earn less than $25,000 a year, about, you know, for rural Vermonters, transportation fuel costs can be about 10% of their overall budget. And a big reason for that is the high cost and the price volatility of gasoline and diesel vehicles. If you compare it to a statewide average for EVs, the charging cost is much lower than the fuel costs for these vehicles over time. And it can be even lower if you're in a territory that, like Green Mountain Power or Burlington Electric, that offers a EV charging rate, which is about the equivalent of $1 a gallon for GMP and 60 cents a gallon for Burlington Electric. But again, you see this is data from the Department of Transportation, the cost per mile traveled by vehicle. You know, diesel and gasoline vehicles, the most expensive to drive and maintain compared to hybrid electric vehicles. This is an example of some of the transportation cost savings after incentives are stacked on top of each other. And we are in a fortunate position in Vermont that a lot of these incentives are, you know, when you combine them all, can get to cut the sticker price, the MSRP, in half for new electric vehicles. This is an example comparing a Nissan Leaf with a Nissan Sentra. So that was a quick overview of some of the transportation sector information. I'm going to move briefly to the thermal sector, and then we'll stop there so that we can reserve most of the time for questions and comments. So again, these were the highest impact measures identified to reach the thermal sector share of emissions reduction that it's responsible for. This is kind of how it's been modeled. This is a great graph that our senior fellow Lee Seddon put together, but it's first, we're trying to reduce the overall heating load via efficiency. And then we're trying to reduce the amount of that remaining heating load that is met from fossil fuel, this orange line going down over time, displacing that, replacing it with low carbon energy. You saw heat pumps, you saw advanced wood heat, you saw renewable natural gas, that increasing over time so that this purple line, the emissions, are going down in concert with our emissions reduction requirements. The similar story to what we saw on the high cost and price volatility for gas and diesel on the propane and fuel oil side of things. In general, when you're heating with efficient electric heat pumps, that's that blue line, or with wood pellets, that's this light green line, you are paying less year over year, month over month, and you have much more price stability than on this roller coaster like cost curve for fuel oil and propane. And again, it's a similar story in terms of what it means for the Vermont economy overall. Fuel oil in particular, 85% cents of every dollar we spend on it drains right out of the Vermont economy. Whereas electricity, as we talked about before, 62 cents on every dollar stays and recirculates. Wood, the vast majority of wood here, especially cordwood and wood chips, is 100 cents of every dollar stays and recirculates in state. This 80% is an overall number, an average for all wood heating. So it's a little bit lower than 100 because we do import some wood pellets. This is a breakdown of emissions by sector and fuel type. Most of the thermal sector emissions are coming from residential, over half, nearly a third from commercial, and just 15% from industrial. And you can see the breakdown by fuels. Most of this is climate pollution coming from our use of fuel oil and propane, but also from natural gas as well. In terms of that key first step around weatherization on reducing the heating load through efficiency, this is annual numbers of homes comprehensively weatherized in Vermont since 2008. We saw an increase up to 2012, but then a decline, and it's been relatively flat over the past 5 years. So to give you a sense of context, we're averaging about 2,000 homes weatherized a year. Just to meet that this fifth highest impact measure as part of the overall pathways to get to our emissions reduction requirements. Just to do this, we would need to weatherize 5 to 6 times more homes per year than we are now. So instead of 2,000 homes a year, more like 10 to 12,000 homes a year. This, I think, explains it well. This is what we said we'd do. 10 VSA 581 said we would weatherize 80,000 homes by 2020. We didn't come close to that. It's more like 30,000 as of 2019. And our pace is business as usual would be about this. But as part of those emissions reduction pathways analysis, we likely need to be up around here by 2030. So overall story, the fossil fueled status quo is a drain on the Vermont economy and a strain on Vermont consumers. It is not helping our economic strength or vitality, especially when we consider that clean energy jobs in Vermont are 6% of all jobs, the highest share of clean energy jobs of any state in the country. They're generally higher paying. So we should be investing in electrification because it's better for the Vermont economy and it's better for Vermont consumers. There are some challenges, though, in terms of achieving that. One of them is that even though our electricity portfolio is much, much cleaner than all of the fossil options for heating and transportation, when you look at the taxes and fees we pay on electricity, it's much higher than we are paying for the fossil options. So this, you could, and I think most rational people would look at this and say that this is backwards, that what we want to be doing is having the lowest taxes and fees on the least polluting energy sources and higher taxes and fees on the most polluting to have them contributing their fair share towards this transition. One question that has frequently come up in the last couple of years is, what does this amount of beneficial electrification of the transportation and thermal sectors mean for the grid? This shows Vermont's annual peak electricity load. The peak our all-time peak was back in 2006, a little over 1,100 megawatts. That's what Velco describes as the current peak load capacity. But the great news here, part of the silver lining, is that because our efficiency utilities, including Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric Department, have done such great work working with their customers over the last couple of decades, that peak load has gone down. And so now we have significant headroom that will allow us to electrify those transportation and thermal sectors. So there is a lot more I could go into, but looking at the time, I am going to stop there. And just again, with a reminder that the electronic version of this report with many more graphics, all the sources, all the detail will be up on the EAN website next week, but that is the sneak preview. Let me stop my sharing. Oh, and I should say, before, this is the last slide. We are in the process of looking ahead, planning for the next year of EAN's work. And to help inform that, we have a survey that Cara sent out to our network members last week. VECAN is a network member, and as members of VECAN, you are all by extension EAN members. So if you, I'm going to actually copy that. Well, after I stop sharing screen, I'll copy that link and put it in the chat. And if any of you liked this presentation, the best way to thank us is to take 15 minutes and fill out that survey sometime later today. It'll help us with our planning. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jared. That is, as always, really helpful. You know, the most current context, you know, sort of, and highly visually able to wrap our heads around what, you know, what we're talking about here when we're talking about making this transition. So thank you for your hard work, to you and your team, and to all the partners that you highlighted earlier, and probably others who have helped make this possible. So really appreciate that. There are lots of questions coming up in the chat. Please feel free to continue to put your questions in the chat, and I'm going to try and get through them. There are a couple questions that, related to the impact of telecommuting, Jared, and, you know, sort of how you've been measuring and gauging that, and just sort of like a statement around thinking it might have had more of an beneficial greenhouse gas emissions impact. Can you speak to how you did gauge the impact of telecommuting, benefits of it? And you know, maybe any.
Thanks, Joey. And I'll just note that apologies, I was not monitoring the chat. It would have been too distracting. So I'm just going back now and looking at some of those questions that came in, and there's some really good ones in there that I'm excited to talk about. But yeah, on the telecommuting side, I can't remember the exact numbers, but basically to do our emissions reduction pathways analysis, we had to choose a baseline year, and we did 2018, where the telecommute numbers were a lot lower than they rose to in 2020. And so we had to estimate how durable was that increase. How much did we think the kind of pandemic telecommuting would continue kind of post-pandemic? And so we kind of split the difference and basically said that we expect telecommuting to go down post-pandemic, but that we think that it has the chance to be significantly above what it was in 2018, that some of these changes will be more durable and permanent. In terms of the exact numbers, you know, those will be in that annual progress report, and we are working on publishing a white paper that walks folks through the assumptions and the findings of that emissions reduction pathways analysis as its own standalone piece that we hope to have out in the next couple of months.
That's great. Thank you, Jared. This is a question. Samantha Lash, you had a good question, and do you want to turn your video on and ask your question of Jared?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Sam, she, her. Thank you so much for this presentation. Is really useful. I have to say I was inspired to ask this question from the Ethics Energy Committee. So give the credit where credit is due for sure. But I guess given the focus ahead on reductions in transportation and particularly building thermal, I guess how do we push against what I would call falling standards in comprehensive weatherization projects, so the actual standards that are being used? It seems like they've been reduced over the past few years. For example, the blowers test now, I think they're accepting a 10% reduction in air leakages versus 20 to 30 as a minimum in other states, and then 40 to 50 according to the Energy Conservatory, among other bodies. So what exactly, like, where are we on the standards that these things are being used for, and how do we, instead of doing more homes, do we need to do some of the homes better?
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. There are probably others on the call who are better situated to respond to the kind of standards question. I can say what we modeled, and that was the kind of requirement that was, or the target that was in 10 VSA 581, basically the weatherization law that passed in 2008, which aimed for a 25% reduction in fuel use. And so, you know, when you look at the reports that go to the Public Service Department from all the weatherization providers, you know, overall, many of them meet that 25% average, but there's a lot of variation within individual projects. Some homes are getting 50% fuel reduction, some homes are getting 10. And I think that you're absolutely right that the extent to which we can do kind of comprehensive, deep retrofits to make sure we're getting as significant a savings as possible, both from an emissions reduction perspective and from a consumer savings perspective over time, that's important, that we're not leaving you know, that on the table. But just so folks know, when we say weatherization or comprehensive home retrofits, we're assuming a 25% heating load reduction and fuel consumption reduction as a result of those projects, but also knowing that there's a lot of variation that happens project to project.
Thanks, Jared. And just because she offered, another VECAN partner at Efficiency Vermont, Kelly Lucci, is on the line and may be able to speak more specifically to the program standards. Kelly, take it away.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll do it super quick because I don't want to distract from all the other great information, but it's an awesome question. So for what it's worth, that is the minimum standard, the 10% air leakage reduction. The vast majority of projects get more than 20%. And part of the reason we introduced that was because we had a lot of customers who wanted to be able to chunk out projects over time, as opposed to doing it all in one hit. As the program has tried to, we've tried to make it more flexible such that the program can serve the needs of folks who don't necessarily have the dollars to take on one weatherization project as comprehensively as we would like at one time. And if we held to that top standard for getting incentives at all, rather than letting people maybe do a little bit over the course of a few years, it was really challenging for them to access program incentives. So it's a constant balancing act. I think you'll probably see us moving things a little bit more comprehensively over the next 1 to 2 years, but that's how we got where we are. And it doesn't mean that projects are only getting 10% standard savings. Very few of them are at that level, for what it's worth.
Thank you, Kelly, for rounding that out and really important context. Peggy O'Neill Vivanco asked a really important question, and I think it would be helpful to share. Peggy, do you want to ask your question, or I'm happy to just read it?
Sure, I can ask it. And then in the interest of full disclosure, I am a proud network member of 2 teams with EAN. So grateful for the work that you folks all do. So my question is really about biofuels and wondering where they fit, especially in the heavy duty and medium duty sectors. I also just saw one question about renewable natural gas, which just very briefly is a way to kind of capture the methane, usually from dairy farms manure or from landfills, to scrub that and inject it into the pipeline, either for the thermal sector or to get it into transportation. And I'm not going to speak for Vermont Natural Gas or Vermont Gas Systems, but I know they do have RNG into some of the thermal sector, and they're running RNG in a couple of their kind of medium duty vehicles. But just thinking about like biodiesel, even though it still has diesel in the name, that is something in the medium and heavy duty sector with the right policies, we can move the needle today with the vehicles we have, increasing that bio blend from like B5 to B20, and look at other cold climate states and look at the emission reductions for that. So just wondering where biofuels fit in with this, and what do we do to get the policy to help support implementation for those sectors. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks, Peggy. Great question. I'm not going to speak to the policy side. You and others are better positioned to speak to that, but I'll just speak for the pathways model. We did include biodiesel in the as a transportation measure, blended in with diesel for both either the light or heavy duty diesel fleet. And we also included B100 being blended or used directly. Actually, my backup heating system is a furnace that uses B100 biodiesel. So it's also a measure on the thermal side, as you mentioned. And part of the challenge, though, in estimating the emissions reduction from biofuels is that there's such variation in the emissions profile based on the sourcing. Where B100 biodiesel is great when it's coming from, it's locally sourced recycled restaurant oil like Black Bear is producing, and but if it's virgin material from somewhere around the world, the different carbon footprints are important to be aware of. And so we had difficulty modeling that. The other thing is that Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, in compliance with IPCC protocol, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and EPA guidance, does not use life cycle emissions factors, but oftentimes for the benefits, that both a more accurate understanding of the impact of biofuels and to more fully capture their benefits, you need to use life cycle accounting. And so I think that that's something that we're going to need to look at as a state, is supplementing our existing greenhouse gas emissions inventory with life cycle analysis of all of our energy sources. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to compare biofuels like biodiesel on kind of an apples to apples basis with some of the fossil alternatives.
Thanks, Jared. I'm going to try and zoom through a couple more questions. We're getting some really good ones. I would, Cheryl Hogan, if you're on the line, do you want to ask your question of Jared? And we can try to be brief so we can get to a few more. But Cheryl, are you here?
Sure. I just unmuted. This is Cheryl. Thanks. Maybe I can ask it a little more simply. I know we currently route a lot of our heavy duty trucks through our small towns and villages. And Vermont has successfully alleviated that in some communities with road plans and so forth. Not necessarily with a focus on vulnerability or equity. How can we get involved or stay more informed with that process on planning?
It's a good question, Cheryl, that I have to confess, I don't really know the answer to. I don't know if there's anyone else on the call who might be more familiar and be willing to offer a response. I will just say that, one of the things that we looked at as part of our report was some of the multiple benefits of moving away from fossil fuels in these sectors. And one of them, especially for heavy duty and diesel vehicles, is the reduction in particulate matter pollution, which is a significant kind of health effect on respiratory issues. And, we saw it was a real, nationwide, the communities that had the highest both or the kind of worst symptoms and effects from COVID-19 were those that had the highest PM emissions, frequently communities of color across the country. But so the extent to which we can get off of diesel will not only have an emissions reduction benefit, but also kind of a local air quality and reducing particulate emissions. So it's not an answer to your question, but I think it's like yet another reason why being able to do that is valuable.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, well, thank you. And just wondering about, the specifics on certain localities and how they went about, getting the roundabouts built and so forth in some communities where they were impacted. There are so many co-benefits like you mentioned.
one other thing I just would put on people's radar that doesn't exactly answer your question, I think turning to our partners at the Agency of Transportation, but this is a question that I hope may also come up and be answered. The comprehensive energy plan that we have comes up every 6 years now for an update. That process is getting underway, and in June, in partnership with the regional planning commissions, there will be the beginning of a public engagement process seeking input on the comprehensive energy plan, and and being an opportunity to get some questions answered and offering your ideas for how we move forward towards the 90% by 2050 total renewable energy goal. So stay tuned for that. Jeff Martin asked a really good question. Jeff, are you on the line, and do you want to ask your question about the electric sector and Hydro-Quebec?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Joey, and thanks for the great presentation, Jared. Yeah, I was just wondering about the electricity sector and the emission reductions that we see there. I just wondered if you know how much of that's coming from new renewable energy sources versus just a change in REC accounting. And with that, given that the bulk of the electrical portfolio is from Hydro-Quebec and other large hydro sources, and I don't think those are considered zero carbon sources by other New England states. So I'm just wondering, is that reduction somewhat misleading, or do we need to focus more on the electricity sector than maybe those numbers show?
Thanks, Jeff. I think it's such an important question, and it's really, the more and more that I dig into this and learn about it from you and others, the more complex I realize it is. So for this report, since it's a report for the state of Vermont, we try to follow the Vermont law around the renewable energy standard and what the Public Service Department reports in compliance with the renewable energy standard. And so that follows our electricity purchases, for our electricity portfolio in the emissions profile of those purchases. Now, of course, the emissions profile of our portfolio based on the REC accounting is different than the emissions of our electricity use, given that we're connected to the ISO New England grid. So even if Vermont is contributing to a more renewable portfolio by its REC purchases than, say, New Hampshire is, which doesn't have a renewable energy standard, in some ways, from a practical perspective, we're using the exact same electricity that New Hampshire is. And I think that is somewhat reflective of just the unique nature of the physics of electricity, right? Electrons and ions that go into the grid, aren't, there's no Vermont electricity grid. I mean, we're part of a regional grid, even if we speak about Vermont's electricity emissions as measured by the RES. So I think that the most important things are that, A, to underpin the emissions reductions from beneficial electrification, it needs to be built on a foundation of no and low carbon electricity. And so, I think the good news is that the RES, Vermont's renewable energy standard, is increasing its requirements for that each year. Hopefully other states will do the same and increase their standards. We need to be making sure that we're not adding new fossil generation to the grid. At this point in time, we've got to make sure that the grid is as clean as possible. I would just say that even if you don't, if you think that REC accounting is problematic, and I understand that and share some of those criticisms, and you just look at the emissions profile of the ISO New England grid, it is one of the top 3 cleanest grids in the country, along with California and New York. And so, for instance, even if you don't use Vermont's REC accounting emissions numbers for electricity, and you just use ISO New England, driving an EV in the ISO New England territory is the equivalent of getting 150 miles per gallon. That's partially because electric motors are so much more efficient than internal combustion engines, but it's also because the ISO New England grid has been getting more renewable and lower emitting over time. So Yeah, I guess I would say that I think that that's a really fair and important question. It's a complex topic, and we try to provide data in the report that allow you to look at it from any angle that you think is most appropriate. We don't want to put our finger on the scale and say there's only one right way on such a complex topic.
Yeah, thank you. And I totally agree. We need to electrify everything, and so not going to disagree with that at all. Just thinking more long term as we approach, the more like net zero goal. We'll have to be thinking more about the electricity sector.
Great. Thank
Yeah.
you, Jeff. And go ahead.
If it's okay, Jerry, just quickly, I want to say that it's one of the reasons we focus so much on the transportation and thermal sectors in the EAN report is A, that's where the emissions are coming from. B, that's where most of our energy costs are. And so, we have to, it's kind of a win-win for reducing emissions and reducing costs by focusing there. But that is not meant to be to the exclusion of a focus on the electricity sector. We really see a clean electricity sector as the foundation that needs to and must continue cleaning up. I say must because we're legally required to under the res, and there may be further improvements that can and will be made to that. So it's just recognizing that there is one sector that has regulatory requirements for emissions reduction, electricity, while there's two others that are where the bulk of emissions come from, where we don't have a policy and regulatory framework yet to drive down emissions. So we want to focus there so that we can bring that up, so that we can move forward on a total energy basis by reducing emissions across all of our energy sectors and economy-wide, recognizing that there are other non-energy sectors contributing to climate pollution as well.
Absolutely. I'm going to take it over and take it from there and put a couple of extra things on your radar in terms of staying tuned for when Energy Action Network has their finalized report. There's likely to be another, if not more, other opportunities to continue to dive deeper into the final analysis that Jared and his team gave us a primer on today. Thank you so much for that, Jared. It is clear that we have a good foundation of information on which to make informed, decisions and make thoughtful progress. We have a new climate council and a climate action plan that is getting developed as we speak, and a new comprehensive energy plan being updated. So there are going to be really important opportunities for your ongoing public engagement and sharing your thoughts and priorities into those processes. And as Jared noted, helping to sort of ensure that the state of Vermont puts in place the policies and the programs that are going to drive the transition that we so need, and in the transportation and thermal sectors where we currently lack some of the levers to pull to require progress, and to ensure that we're getting the benefits of that progress in terms of making sure that more vulnerable, lower income, BIPOC Vermonters can access and avail themselves of the clean energy solutions, and that we're really thoughtfully doing our part on climate, which is already impacting us here in the state of Vermont. To that end, Samantha asked one last question, or I want to just ask you to pencil in as we finalize the details of I hope for webinar on May 26th at noon with our amazing state climatologist, Leslie Ann Dupigny-Giroux, who is a member of the Vermont Climate Council on the Science and Data Subcommittee with Jared, who also was a lead author of the Northeast Climate Assessment. So Leslie is an amazing wealth of knowledge and will be able to help ground this conversation about the pathways and the types of programs and policies that we might put forward in a climate action plan and undertake here in the state of Vermont in general, and really ground us in the science of climate change. So May 26th at noon, pencil that in, look for more information. And again, look for further opportunities coming from us and others as all this work really ramps up. And I'm very cognizant of your time. I really appreciate everyone's time today, and Jared, your team's important work in service of the state of Vermont and these really important issues. So thank you so much for joining us today. Enjoy this gorgeous day and this very, very hot week.
Great to be with you all. And please fill out that survey if you've got an extra 15 minutes today. We loved hearing your feedback. The link's in the chat. Thanks to Becca and Ian.
Thanks, everyone.